You wake up in the middle of the night, your body tense, drenched in sweat. The world outside is silent, but inside your mind, it's chaos. Thoughts crash into each other, bills piling up, expectations weighing you down, the unspoken rule that you must always keep everything together. The burden of being the provider isn't just a responsibility, it's a quiet storm that never passes. You reach for your phone, its glow casting sharp shadows across the room. Notifications, reminders, unfinished tasks. It never stops. Most nights you push through, numbing the exhaustion, telling yourself it's just another day. But tonight feels different. Tonight, the weight isn't just heavy, it's suffocating. You've spent years being the strong one, the one who never wavers, the one who makes sure everyone else is safe. But in the stillness of the night, when no one is looking, for as long as you can remember, you've worn this role like armor. It's what you were taught, to provide, to protect, to sacrifice, and you did it without hesitation. But somewhere along the way, the lines blurred. Your needs became an afterthought, your dreams faded into the background, and your identity? It became nothing more than the sum of what you could offer. How many times have you promised yourself that one day you'd finally breathe? That after the next bill, the next promotion, the next obligation, you'd find time for yourself? But someday never comes. And now, the exhaustion isn't just in your body, it's in your soul. And yet, the most unsettling truth isn't just the exhaustion, it's the realization that the more you give, the more is expected. The sacrifices are rarely acknowledged, the effort rarely seen. But where does that leave you when you have nothing left to give? When the provider, the protector, the one who always shows up, starts to fade into someone even he doesn't recognize? The world applauds resilience, but it rarely asks at what cost. You've carried it all without complaint, without hesitation. But deep down, there's a quiet fear, one you barely admit even to yourself. If you are only seen for what you provide, will anyone notice when you start to disappear? And so, the question lingers, pressing against your chest like a weight you can't shake. If the provider is all you've ever been, then who are you when there's nothing left to give? The frustration you feel isn't just about modern life's demands. It's woven into the very foundation of how you were shaped. From childhood, the message was clear. A man's worth is measured by his ability to provide. It's a script passed down through generations, dictating how men should see themselves and how the world should see them. But beneath this script lies a deeper truth, one that's been ignored for too long. The act of providing, once a source of pride, has slowly reshaped your sense of self, making you question whether the life you're living is truly your own. Gabor Mate, a renowned psychologist who studies human behavior and trauma, might argue that this frustration is rooted in emotional suppression. He suggests that society conditions men to detach from their true emotions, forcing them to suppress pain, vulnerability, and even their deepest desires to meet external expectations. You weren't just taught to provide, you were trained to silence yourself in the process. The more you ignored your own needs, the more the world applauded you for it. But Mate warns that suppressing emotions doesn't make them disappear. It only buries them deeper, leading to stress, burnout, and a growing sense of emptiness. And that emptiness, it isn't just psychological, it's physiological. According to Mate, the body keeps score. The exhaustion you feel, the tension in your chest, the sleepless nights, it's all the result of a life spent neglecting yourself in order to serve others. The question is, how long can a person keep giving before their body or mind forces them to stop? Then there's the perspective of Erich Fromm, a social psychologist who explored the conflict between societal expectations and individual freedom. From believing that many people unknowingly live according to roles assigned to them, rather than making conscious choices about who they want to be. In your case, being the provider was never a decision. It was an expectation placed upon you from birth. He described this as a form of psychological imprisonment, where people conform to external pressures out of fear rather than true purpose. You've spent years fulfilling this role, but have you ever truly chosen it? Or has it been chosen for you? Arthur Schopenhauer had an even darker view of this struggle. He believed human existence is driven by an endless cycle of desire, one that can never be fully satisfied. You provide, you achieve, you sacrifice, only to realize that the sense of fulfillment fades as soon as you reach the next milestone. The pursuit of more, whether it's money, success, or validation, becomes a never-ending loop. No matter how much you give, the hunger never disappears, and the exhaustion only deepens. Then there's the existential dread that Jean-Paul Sartre described, the weight of realizing that no amount of external achievement can define your inner purpose. When every waking moment is consumed by meeting the needs of others, your own existence begins to blur. Sartre would say this is bad faith, a state where a person lives according to expectations instead of authentic self-expression. In the quiet moments, you start to wonder, when did you stop living for yourself? This unseen weight, this battle between societal conditioning, psychology, and the self, it's not just frustration. It's the slow unraveling of a truth too painful to ignore. When the provider's role is stripped away, what remains is the real question, and that question demands an answer. The role of provider isn't just demanding, it's consuming. It shapes how you see yourself, how others see you, and over time, it quietly erodes your emotional and psychological well-being. The damage doesn't appear all at once. It builds slowly, hidden beneath a life spent meeting everyone's needs but your own. Psychologist Dr. Peter Levine, known for his work on trauma and stress, suggests that chronic self-neglect triggers a survival response in the body. When you're constantly giving without replenishing, your nervous system remains in a prolonged state of tension. This leads to exhaustion, anxiety, and emotional numbness, the body's way of coping with an unrelenting burden. Over time, the stress you ignore doesn't just disappear. It embeds itself, manifesting as burnout, irritability, and even physical illness. Cognitive distortions reinforce this trap. The sunk cost fallacy convinces you that because you've invested so much into this role, you must keep going, no matter the cost. Walking away, setting boundaries, or prioritizing yourself feels like failure. But is it failure, or is it self-preservation? Society adds another layer of conditioning. Vulnerability, the very thing that could free you, is seen as a flaw. Men are expected to be unshakable, resilient, unwavering. But suppression doesn't make emotions disappear. It buries them deeper, where they fester as resentment, loneliness, and quiet suffering. Over time, these unseen consequences take root. The weight of always being strong, always giving, becomes heavier. And then, one day, you realize the role you thought defined you has slowly erased you. There comes a moment when you realize that the life you've built, the endless cycle of giving, sacrificing, and proving yourself, can no longer sustain you. The weight has become unbearable. But here's the truth. Breaking free isn't just possible, it's necessary. The only way forward is a radical shift in perspective, one that dismantles the very beliefs that have kept you trapped. The first step in this rebellion is accepting a truth that may feel unsettling at first. You are more than your role. You are not just a provider, a protector, or a worker. You are a human being with an identity that exists beyond what you do for others. Dr. Gabor Mate, a renowned expert on trauma and addiction, argues that when we tie our self-worth to external validation, we disconnect from our true selves. The more you sacrifice who you are for the sake of others, the more you risk losing touch with your own needs, emotions, and desires. Reclaiming yourself starts with something many have been conditioned to fear: vulnerability. Society has long told men that vulnerability is weakness, that admitting exhaustion or emotional pain makes you less of a man. But Dr. Brené Brown, a researcher on shame and resilience, argues the opposite. Vulnerability is the birthplace of true strength. It is only by embracing your emotions, your frustrations, your fears, your longing for something more, that you can begin to live authentically. Then comes the hardest part, redefining your identity. You've spent years, maybe decades, measuring your worth by how much you provide. But this measure is flawed. Instead of seeking external validation, Dr. Carl Rogers, a pioneer of humanistic psychology, would urge you to focus on self-actualization, the process of living in alignment with your true self, not the expectations imposed upon you. You are not here to merely serve a role. You are here to discover, create, and experience life in your own way. Breaking free also means confronting your own limitations. You cannot give endlessly without depletion. You cannot be everything to everyone. And setting boundaries is not selfishness. It is self-preservation. Learning to say no, prioritizing your mental health, and choosing yourself when necessary is an act of courage. The world may not applaud you for it, but your soul will. And perhaps the most revolutionary act of all, stop measuring your worth by what you provide. Your value is not in what you give, but in who you are. The rebellion doesn't start with a dramatic gesture or a grand escape. It starts with a simple but powerful realization. You are enough, not because of what you do, but because you exist. There is a haunting beauty in the moment you realize that everything you've been striving for, the role of the provider, was never your true purpose. This revelation doesn't just shake you, it dismantles the very foundation upon which your identity was built. And in that destruction, something profound emerges. You are more than what you can provide. The ultimate truth is this: your worth is not tied to how much you sacrifice for others. It exists regardless of what you give. Dr. Carl Rogers, a pioneer in humanistic psychology, argued that self-worth is intrinsic. It does not need external validation. You are not merely a sum of your obligations or a product of societal expectations. You are a dynamic, evolving individual with a right to define your own existence beyond the roles imposed upon you. This realization creates a paradigm shift, the understanding that the endless pursuit of being the provider is not a path to fulfillment, but a prison. In fact, this role may be the very thing keeping you from genuine self-actualization. The more you pour into others at the expense of yourself, the more you build frustration, resentment, and emotional exhaustion. But in stepping away from this cycle, you reclaim your identity. You rediscover your ability to live on your own terms. Now imagine the freedom of breaking this pattern, not measuring your worth by what you provide, but by the simple fact that you exist. Dr. Gabor Mate, an expert on trauma and self-identity, suggests that true healing comes when we stop seeking external approval and begin embracing ourselves fully. This shift isn't about abandoning responsibility. It's about recognizing that your well-being matters just as much as anyone else's. This truth unlocks a deeper level of self-compassion. You begin to understand that prioritizing yourself is not selfish, it is essential. Without nurturing your own emotional, physical, and psychological needs, you cannot offer genuine care to others. As the saying goes, you cannot pour from an empty cup. But when you care for yourself, you create a space where love, connection, and fulfillment can flow naturally, not from obligation, but from choice. Listen, freedom comes when you stop defining yourself by what you give and instead embrace the fullness of who you are. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful realization of all. Let me know what you think in the comments section.